Let's help you place these damning allegations now and bring in political analyst Sanusha Naidu, who joins us now via our video link. Sanusha, really concerning, that's just one way of putting it, not least of which because legitimacy is our currency in the media space, and allegations like this surely put that at risk.
Absolutely, and good evening to you and the listeners. Absolutely, and I think it's legitimacy and credibility, two very core words and critical words to underpin the foundations and the pillars of the fourth estate. And I think to a large extent, the revelations and the testimony that was given by Ms. Kay today before the Zondo Commission was quite revealing and, in fact, if not scary, in terms of how money was manipulated and used in order to create a kind of propagandist machinery within the media. In order to spin stories and to spin a credibility issue that essentially was to create a positive vibe around the presidency of Jacob Zuma. And of course, this is not something I think, we've got to basically preface this and say, this is not something new. It happens the world over, but we shouldn't actually use that as a foundation of an argument to say, oh, okay, so this is happening all over the world. And so South Africa is just conforming to norms and standards that are practiced elsewhere. But I think what it does expose is that there's another dimension to state capture, which hasn't necessarily needs to be explored further, and that is what happens outside, how state resources have been used in order to promote particular agendas outside of the state architecture.
That's right. I mean, you speak about this not being new. I'm reminded of Bell Pottinger and the white monopoly capital narrative and how we found out that there were strings being pulled insofar as that's concerned. But how is this likely to play out in the political space? Because for better or for worse, it's very difficult in this country, anywhere else in fact, to separate what happens in the media space with how that translates into public perception and ultimately what happens in politics.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing in terms of the political dimension is that it's going to exacerbate tensions between the state and the media. Secondly, it's going to fuel the negative kind of fake news dilemma that faces us in South Africa and across the world with regard to how you now authenticate stories that make particular media spaces, particular platforms in the social media context. And this is actually exacerbates this tension and this growing kind of acrimony that exists between people who believe what certain media outlets put out, whether they have the credibility, the legitimacy, and the authenticity to put this media space, this media news out. And we can see a number of different agencies across the world as well that have been caught in these traps of the social media and the fake news dilemma we see. In terms of the political dimensions, I think it's also very critical right now is to try and understand how money that was supposed to be used in the national security interests of the state and how we define the national security interests of the state has been used to manipulate and advance particular political agendas linked to political parties and the whole question of political party funding. Just taking one of the headlines that came out of your insert is the whole question of money being used for the ANC Nasrec elective conference. That should not have happened if we had the Political Party Funding Act operationalized, if it had gone through in terms of when it was signed into law and when it had to get implemented. I think we would have had more clarity around questions around in terms of accountability of public funds being used in these kinds of very dark ways and in very, very manipulative ways. And of course, irregularities around the use of this money for using it to try and play political battle factions in political parties. Yeah. And I think this is very disturbing.
And the question becomes, can the state security agency recover from this? Do we dare allow it to, if we believe it can, considering, just what you've mentioned in part?
Well, I think, around the world, the state security agencies, the state security architecture has always been a shadow state of the state. It's always operated in dark and very opaque corners. It's operated in a very kind of blurry political and national security interests of the state. It's never been accountable. It's been that unaccountable deep state of the state. And I think to a large extent, this is the kind of tag and the kind of byline that this agency or agencies around the world. The question of recovering, I think, is going to be a difficult one because you need accountability, you need transparency, you need a paper trail. What's being revealed before the Zondo Commission in this week is necessarily what I believe is just the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg is very, very deep in this case. And I'm not sure whether this would have any traction in bringing a kind of particular kind of investigative. I mean, we've had the Mufamadi investigation commission around the state security agency, but in terms of what those recommendations have said and going further in terms of kind of having accountability, transparency, it's going to be very difficult because of the way the nature of operations of state agency works. And I think in terms of the credibility of this, I think people are just going to say, well, what else is new in South Africa? Here's another institution, quite scary, that has just basically manipulated and essentially taken taxpayers' money and used it for their own devices.
Yeah, and what further muddies the water, so to speak, with the State Security Agency is around whether or not we should keep digging, considering, like you've mentioned, the nature of the work the State Security Agency will do. In other words, do we run the risk of potentially putting into the public domain issues that shouldn't be in the public domain, and by extension, put the country's security at risk? You know, I imagine that type of argument being brought up by people who want to hide nefarious activity, but there's some legitimacy to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to, it's going to be very difficult to percolate and filter what's going to be the legitimate agency and the work that the agency does in terms of the national security interest. For me, what is the starting point here is if we get a clarity and some kind of coherence around what defines our national security interest. Clearly, what we see in unfolding before the Zondo Commission is not in the national security interest of South Africa. It's not talking about the borders that are going to need to be manned or the borders that need to be protected or the fact that there's going to be serious issues in terms of a kind of fermenting of populism that can have very disastrous political impacts and effects on society and community. The questions of what is being used in terms of money that is being used in, say, gangsterism, and the whole question of criminal activity, fighting the illegalities of financial transactions and all of that, where this money is going. That is in the national security interest. But what we see before the Zondo Commission is not necessarily, in my opinion, the national interest. It's in the interest of a political party, where you have factional battles. Now, that in itself means that we've got to have clarity. And I know that there are national security documents, there are national interest documents that have been compiled, but we don't get it because they are classified information. But I think the starting point here is for us to be clear on what the national security interest is. And also, I think there are those that are in the field. We don't want to compromise those agencies or those people that are working in national security, compromise their good work and their goodwill that they are doing. So it's a very fine balance. It's a very gray area in terms of the legitimacy and the question of where does this all go and will there be accountability? I think only when we start seeing the declassification of the national security interest documents and the cables that were used, and we see that information be declassified, then we'll know the real story. It seems very much like a James Bond movie in the making.
I'll even suggest that no one would even believe the script because it just keeps getting even more outrageous. Sanusha Naidoo, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate your insight. Sanusha Naidoo is a political analyst joining us there via our video link.